Today we're here with an amazing friend, Aubrey Williams. You've been in Measure Twice Planners for the last year, but it's felt like I've known you for years because you're so vibrant and also like such a integral part of our community because you always show up, you always have great insights, great follow-up questions. You show a lot of gratitude and generosity within Measure Twice Planners. So thanks so much for being here today for a really big topic, but it's such an important topic to discuss. So Aubrey Williams, how are you?
I'm doing very well, and I've been so fortunate to be a part of Measure Twice Planners and finding you and getting to learn from you and work with you. Just about everyone I meet who's interested in being a financial planner, one of, if not the strongest recommendation I give them is to check out Measure Twice Planners
Mm.
over and above any other program, community, educational opportunity. I say do all of them. But if you do nothing else, check out Measure
Mm.
Twice Planners because it has accelerated my growth and my development, both by learning from others and by getting to share about me with other planners, which I was sort of on my own in the wilderness, or it felt like that. And it's really nice not to be alone in the wilderness.
Oh, I appreciate that. I mean, by the way, if anybody's if this ends up in the recording, Aubrey is not like a paid affiliate or anything like that. I always have to remind you, like it's such a place of transparency, right, and generosity. Today's topic is serving the ADHD and neurodivergent community. I'd love to start with this big term, which I have a hard time saying sometimes, but bear with me. So, what is neurodiversity?
Neurodiversity, and sometimes you'll hear a variation of that, neurodivergent, but they refer to the same thing. They refer to a difference in perception or brain processing that can be due to many different causes or symptoms or syndromes or even upbringing. So that if you think of how you would expect a normal or neurotypical person to respond in a given situation, a neurodivergent person likely responds differently. And
Hmm.
since we're talking about financial planning, we can focus on money and finances and the behaviors, thoughts, and emotions that go with it. That people who are neurodiverse, and there are many different kinds of neurodiversity, respond differently. And yeah, this image isn't even inclusive,
Hmm.
but it does a pretty good job. The term first came from the autism spectrum disorder
Hmm.
world, but pretty quickly it began to include other kinds of neurodiversity. And my personal experience is with several of these. I think I have them listed: ADHD for
Hmm.
sure, anxiety, several
Hmm.
types of anxiety that I
Me too. Me too.
experience. Yeah, general social and action paralysis anxiety, depression, rejection sensitivity dysphoria. I'm not sure if that's one that's not on here. And another one that's not on here is it's a field of psychology pioneered by the Polish psychiatrist Kazimierz Dąbrowski
Mhm.
called the theory of positive disintegration. And there are overexcitabilities that he observed and documented. That's sort of a world unto itself, but it fits in with ADHD in that some abilities or characteristics are amplified,
Mm.
like with the hyperactive type of ADHD. Sometimes people's movement, they might move a lot or kick their leg or want to run around the house more than just a normal energetic person.
Mm.
But there's other kinds of overexcitabilities like emotional or intellectual or sensual, which refers to senses, not the bedroom. And so that's part of my experience also. And then one I was very glad to see included in this is cultural diversity.
Mm.
And as you might imagine, different cultures have very different ways of thinking about similar life
Mm.
experiences. The United States is noteworthy for a very individualistic culture,
Mm,
valuing the individual, personal freedom, independence, doing your own thing, being yourself. And other cultures, Asian cultures, not all of them, but many are more collectivist. So there's a higher priority on conforming, on doing what's good for the group.
mm,
So a neurotypical person in that more collectivist culture might be following those norms, and they might consider someone who is very individualistic, who grew up in that country, to be neurodivergent or
mm.
neurodiverse.
Moving away from the norm.
Exactly. Exactly. So it's not just conditions or medical things. It can
Mm,
also be culture and language and upbringing, uh, family patterns, even. These things matter because they show up in people's money lives. That's why we're
mm,
talking about it. And if a person's financial planning practice meets someone with neurodiverse characteristics, they might not get the results or the responses that they anticipate. The client might not achieve what they intend to achieve. And so that's what led me to focus on this area.
in terms of neurodiversity, like that, the term or even ADHD, at what point in life personally did you start to hear and understand those things in more detail?
It wasn't that long ago, believe it or not. My kids both received diagnoses of ADHD and different, it shows up differently in them. So that was educational. And as I was helping them through that process, this was
Mm,
2018, 2019, just before COVID, I thought, well, boy, you know, maybe I should take this
mm,
questionnaire because a lot of these questions are really ringing some bells for me.
mm.
And I took the questionnaire and if it was a test, I would have received an A plus. I checked all the boxes. And one of the somewhat paradoxical things, but it's not once you understand it, is many people, once they receive a diagnosis,
Mm,
or even if they don't receive a diagnosis, they just begin to understand more about ADHD.
mm,
So much of my life up until then made sense. The things
mm,
that were easier for me, the things that were harder for me, things that were painful. And I'll give you an example. I did very well in school, through grade school, through high school, and even through college, undergraduate college. What I recognized, one of the reasons for that was that those are very structured environments.
mm,
There were classes to take and homework to do and tests to complete and prepare for. And if you did all the things, sort of like playing a board game, then you tend to do pretty well. Then I got to graduate school and I had a very different experience in that my professor thought so well of me that he pretty much let me go free range.
Uh-oh.
And what that meant is I was taking very few classes.
Mm,
I liked that because I could focus intensely on those classes. But the rest of the time, it was up to me to structure my
mm,
time and my research, which was in mechanical engineering. That's what my master's is in. That was one of the most difficult experiences of my life because I was, for the first time in my life, missing that structure.
mm,
And that'll lead into what we talk about later, which is how to help people with ADHD
mm,
handle money better, have a better money experience in their life. So it wasn't that long ago, about
yeah.
2019, when
Oh,
I
wow.
learned about this. And like I said, so much of my life made sense.
Mm,
And instead of feeling bad or being frustrated, but what's
mm,
hard, I actually learned that these experiences were very common for
mm,
people with ADHD. Combine that with what you mentioned, which
mm,
was I was $90,000 in debt. I was going through a divorce. It was an emergency for me
mm,
to right my financial ship. And I was looking everywhere I could for how to do it. The financial planners that I sought out, they were very good people, very talented. They were interested in helping me invest my money.
Mm,
And I know that that's not true of all financial planners, but those are the ones I found. And what I really needed help with was cash flow,
mm,
budgeting, because I had always been very good at making money and also very good at spending money. And it didn't tend to stick around. And so at that point in my life, that was a problem. And where I did find help was in the financial independence community.
mm,
And you're a part of that. You've appeared on the Choose FI podcast and many other venues frequently. I found help in Jacob Lund Fisker of Early Retirement Extreme,
mhm,
Mr. Money Mustache and his blog and forum, Early Retirement Extreme, Dr. Karsten Yeske, and the Choose FI podcast. And through those sources, I built a toolbox to help
mm,
me with cash flow, with
mm,
budgeting, with savings rate.
mm,
That was part of the puzzle, but it still wasn't adapted to ADHD. And so that I
mm.
had to figure out on my own.
Even before becoming a financial planner, just thinking about your own finances, which aspects, maybe we'll kind of like bring in ADHD into this, like which aspects of just personal finance and that executive function of managing your money is difficult for somebody, I guess, generally with ADHD?
One of the commonly misunderstood aspects, and you dropped a clue to it about ADHD. It has the word attention deficit in it. And so that might lead someone to believe that it's difficult for a person with ADHD to pay attention.
Squirrel, 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 right?
Right. And it's not completely wrong, but what tends to happen, the most common pattern, is that a person is able to pay intense attention to
Mm,
something that is interesting to them. And
mm,
it just so happens that many things are interesting to most people with ADHD. And so sustained focus on something, even something that I knew was very important, which was cash flow, budgeting,
mm,
savings rate, paying down my debt, that was difficult. And so it does end up being better described, and even by scientists in the field, as a disorder of executive function. And executive function just describes the process of thinking of something you would like to accomplish, making a plan to accomplish
mm,
it, and then stepping through the process of accomplishing it, sometimes over time, sometimes
mhm,
having to resist impulses that would draw you away from that,
mm,
having to delay gratification, and everyone, is better or worse
mhm,
at different parts of this. But people with ADHD as a group have great difficulty with this. And
mm,
it shows up in money, it shows up in relationships, in that often there's emotional impulsivity that comes out, anger that's expressed that other people might put a pause on,
mm,
choices, risk-taking behaviors. And so it's not just about money, but because I've made my focus on financial planning, that's what I'm paying attention to and
mm.
helping people with. And so I had to build that structure, and we'll talk about exactly what that is. I tried many things and figured out what worked for me.
Mm,
That's the core of the system that I use with people.
yeah.
But over the years, working with clients, uh, I've added to that toolbox, and
Mm.
we can look at that as well.
I would love that. Now, I immediately think I think of that book is behind me, Atomic Habits.
Yes.
There's a lot of book around building habits, but one of the ideas I think of is the difference between, I guess there's a lot here, but discipline versus automation, Also,
Yes.
typically if you want to start doing something or create a habit, you try to make it fun and easy. Habit stacking is pretty popular. Is like kind of stack it on top of something you already enjoy. So like if there's something that you want to start doing that you don't necessarily enjoy to start, maybe stack it, kind of intertwine it with the things that you do enjoy. In terms of helping somebody with financial planning, in terms of ADHD, is it more about adding discipline to their life or more about making personal finance really intertwined with what they already enjoy?
I think it's closer to discipline, but I think we need to go into that a little more
Mhm.
because it might look different than many people would think.
What is your role when working with clients in terms of, do you think of yourself as a coach, a tutor, a teacher, and, an advisor? How do you think of yourself in that way?
I do think of myself as a coach, and this is a pretty common experience. People with ADHD, again, as a rule, everyone's different, they tend to be voracious learners because of the stimulation provided by learning something new or
Mhm.
finding the best thing. And that's a superpower, but it's also a super weakness. And I
Mhm.
embrace both of those. What it means is that most of the people that I work with have heard about everything that I'm telling them. They've probably tried it, maybe tried it more than once and failed. What I bring is confidence that what I'm recommending will likely work for them,
Mhm.
or that we can make small adjustments to it so that it does work for them. And I invite them to try it on like a sweater, but the certainty of another person saying, I know pretty well what your experience is like. I have been through this, I have tried it, and this is a solid place to start,
Mhm.
helps settle the person into giving it a long enough try so that some
Mhm.
results can happen. And there's nothing more motivating than consistent results, even
Mhm.
small ones, even very small ones.
Mhm.
Even doing the thing tomorrow that you said you were going to do last night, no matter how small, that's sometimes a rare experience for someone with ADHD. Because last night it might have been very interesting and felt very important, but this morning something else has come up, something else that
Mhm.
feels even more important.
Sometimes when I'm learning about my own anxiety, which is very specific, right? Specific types
Hmm.
of trauma and panic and, rumination and things. Sometimes I get frustrated when I seek, I seek resources and you find a lot of people telling you what to do who haven't actually experienced the thing.
Mm,
So a part of me
yes.
questions, can somebody
Hmm.
without ADHD, like, are they an appropriate financial planner or coach for somebody who does?
I would say yes. They absolutely can be. I'd say it helps to have had similar experiences, but through education, a person can educate themselves, and then
Mm,
by working with people and going through the process
right.
that they're teaching and recommending, I think it's absolutely possible for someone, for example, special needs trusts. It's a very specific area of financial planning. Someone who has been in that situation has a reason to learn about it, and it's more likely that they'll become an expert in it.
Hmm.
But if someone feels powerfully that that's their way to contribute to the world, to
Mm,
helping make the world a better place, can that person educate themselves and make themselves the best special needs trust planner possible? Absolutely, I believe that. It's just easier, and there's a
right.
reason for you to be sort of swimming in those waters if it's your
Right.
life too.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think I actually just posted on social media recently that I think I, on average, have like 2%. Like when I joined the profession, I had about 2% of the wealth of the people I was working with. And, I was kind of questioning myself, like, should you only hire somebody who, like, is at the same place as you? And I mean,
Mm,
you think about financial planning, like, I help people retire early. I have never retired early, right?
right.
So like that's a similar thing that you can kind of think of, neurodiversity, special needs planning, real estate planning, those things like, yeah,
Hmm.
I like that idea of, like you said, a lot of people like they're naturally swimming in that water to begin with personally, and then they just kind of just it's a less of a reach to work with
Yeah.
people. Kind of like most people, I say that most people serve the previous version of themselves, the current
Mm-hmm.
version of themselves, or the future version of themselves as a financial
Sure.
planner. And in my case, I serve kind of where I want to be in 10 years, which is like within 5 years of, being work optional, financially independent. So I love that you mentioned that you don't have to go through the same thing to be an expert or provide advice and guidance in those things. It
Right.
might help whether you have or not. You still need to open the space, right, to avoid
Right.
assumptions, right, to avoid judgment. And we've discussed on Measure Twice Planners. I'll link it below our video here. We discussed biases. I think Aubrey, were you on that
Mm.
call when we talked through some of our
Yes.
right? So as we discuss some of our biases, like sometimes when you've gone through it, it can actually end up being harming your advice. If somebody mentions a diagnosis and you say,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh, my sister has that,"
Right.
and then you start putting these assumptions that everything your sister deals with in life, you place that on top of the client. You've actually just like squeezed all the air out of all the curiosity out of the room. So with that said, I do want to talk a little bit about the self-compassion and kindness idea. You mentioned that ADHD is like about around 2019 where you started to identify that for yourself. When you got an A plus on the ADHD test, um, was your initial thought like positive or negative, or was it more of like a neutral response?
I think because of where I was in my life, it ended up being a positive response.
Hmm.
The reason being, I had so much difficulty that was explained so well, and that
Mm,
diagnosis opened up ways of making that better, or at least finding other people who were going through the same experience. So it was positive for that reason. However, because of the stigma of mental illness, I am not out at the corporate companies that I've worked at. I felt inhibited from
mm,
sharing, except with maybe one or two people in private, that I experienced depression, that I experienced anxiety, that I have ADHD, and the other things we talked about.
mhm,
And I had that same fear coming out as a financial planner.
mm,
And the story that I ran through my head was, why would someone want someone with a disorder, especially
mm,
one that's associated with maybe being disorganized or
mm.
forgetful, or all the other things?
Distracted,
Yeah,
right?
distracted as their go-to person
Mm. To
in
help
an
them get
area,
organized.
right,
Yeah.
to help them get organized.
Mm,
And the focus on niches in the financial planning profession helped me see my way through that.
mm,
And that is, I don't need to be the financial planner for everyone, but there are certain people who will see what I have to offer and even value my vulnerability about what I'm good at and what I have struggled with, and how I've been able to turn some of those weaknesses into strengths, or at
mhm,
least turn them from something that's very difficult to something that isn't a liability, even if it's not yet a super strength. That is what's happening in my life. And so I feel more whole sharing that, instead of
mm,
feeling like I have to hide it. But
mm,
it was still a big step when I put those words up on my
mm,
website as a financial planner, or when I publish videos, as I've done more recently
mm,
on Facebook and other platforms, which are all about ADHD. All of that content, it's
mm.
financial planning focused, but it's all about ADHD. So yeah, I I feel good about it, but it wasn't easy to get to where I am now because of
Mm.
that stigma that still exists. And it is much better than it used to be.
Some people might say, is ADHD real? This is a kind of something in our notes here. Everybody's hyper at certain times and everybody's disorganized at different times. Like that diagnosis either isn't real or they just kind of say, if everybody has it, why does it matter? So how would you respond to that?
There are many things in the world today that are promoting distraction,
Mm,
from the number of streaming channels that are available to the number of podcasts you could listen to the number of friends you can have both in person and online. There's just a tremendous amount of choices and options and inputs and outputs. So it's not surprising to me at all that many people are experiencing fractured attention and challenges associated with that. And that is a part of ADHD. But the analogy that I think is helpful is maybe to use something like sadness or depression as an
mm,
analogy. If you have a dear pet pass away, it's very common for people to enter a period of sadness, or a family member were to pass away. It would be unusual if they didn't.
mhm,
And it may last from months to years, or there may be a component of it that goes on even longer than that. But there's an understandable environmental cause. And
mm,
contrast that with something like clinical depression, where there may be occasional causes,
mm,
but the depth and the intensity
mm.
of the person's sadness and the negative impact on their life is in excess of what you'd expect from the environmental causes.
Yeah.
And ADHD is like that. It's like, yes, the world is distracting. People have difficulty with executive function and planning when they're overwhelmed. But is this a factor in your life almost every day? Does it inhibit your ability to accomplish work,
Mm.
to maintain relationships? And if so, then it might be ADHD. This maybe references to something you asked before about ADHD being identified earlier in life. There's a couple of types of ADHD. There's that are recognized broadly. There's the hyperactive subtype, and that's the one most people are familiar with. It's more common in boys or young men, and it's exhibited externally and physically. And the other type is referred to as inattentive
Mm,
ADHD. Again, the names aren't great. What inattentive refers to is that hyperactivity is primarily internal.
mm,
And although it occurs both in boys and girls, it's more common in girls, and it's much less frequently diagnosed.
mm,
And furthermore, often the hyperactive type that's diagnosed younger and primarily in boys will transition into the inattentive type right around late teens, early adolescence.
mm,
And it's no less challenging because all of that movement and hyper focus and ideation and creativity, there's very good things about it, but
mhm.
it's happening
Right.
internally. And so that's something that has improved tremendously over the last 2 decades, that the different
Mm,
types are recognized and that there are treatments for both. And there's a
mm,
combined type, which is what I have, which is for me less hyperactivity and more inattentive, but both are
mm.
present.
I'm not self-diagnosing myself here, but I will say that, if I watch a YouTube video about chess and I'm like, oh, that was interesting. My next step, again, this is something that, has positive and negative attributes to it. My next step is
Hmm.
getting every book from the library about chess, watching every video on, like, again, I go super deep and narrow, and then I kind of get burned out or bored, and then I
Hmm.
find something else and I go super, super deep. So that inattentiveness to other things is more about the attentiveness of one narrow thing. By the way, like financial planning is one of
Hmm.
those like narrow. That's what's funny. A lot of people are like, wow, like Cody, you love this stuff. And not only do I love this stuff, but there's very few other things that I care about when I'm focused on it. So
Hmm.
financial, like when I go deep into financial planning, if I didn't have other people in my life, like I'd probably like rarely shower, rarely sleep, rarely eat. Cause it's crazy. You might have like some similar things where if you don't have like somebody or something to like stop you, like you'll end up going down like a very narrow rabbit hole but then you'll actually like neglect and put everything else on the back burner, relationships, right?
Yep.
Spiritual practices, mental and physical health, which of course this is, and I do truly believe as they're kind of the stigma is slowly unwinding that mental health is physical health, that
Hmm.
there very much are a lot of chemical things happening that affect the way we live.
That might be a good transition. And let's hold on to that description that you just gave, because what you described, you could refer to as hyperfocus.
Hmm.
And it's not exclusive to people with ADHD, but it's something that people with ADHD frequently experience. And it's really the core of or one of the levers that I use
Mm,
to help people with ADHD, turning something that's often perceived as a liability
mm.
into a strength.
Let's leverage this thing you already have
Yes.
to help you get what you don't have yet.
Yes.
On a
Hmm.
previous Measure Twice Planners call, we were talking about tracking expenses, and some people, they might look at their expenses once a year, or maybe download a CSV file every couple of months, or use YNAB or other Monarch Money. And you said, I look at my expenses every day. And
Hmm.
people were blown away. They're like, wow, like that sounds like a lot of hassle, right? Especially hearing from somebody who helps people like create structure. And I really like, I think maybe that's like a great kind of diving board into this idea. Like, first of all, everybody does it differently, but
Yeah.
also I'm guessing that the way you do even your own personal expenses is leveraging that hyper focus. So yeah, like I would love for you to share, how did you develop financial planning strategies that really work alongside and leverage ADHD?
What you just described, where you become intensely interested in something like chess, where that may last through the video you watched and the 12 books that you get out of the library. And that might be a good stretch, but it has an endpoint. Or
Mhm.
financial planning, in to which you've been interested for several years, and there's a lot of areas to explore there, so that makes
Mhm.
sense. The person with ADHD will have that experience frequently. And when they're coming to me, they've expressed that they want to make a change in their money life, in their
Mhm.
experience with their finances. Maybe it's their savings rate, maybe it's paying down debt, whatever it is they want to accomplish. And so I can pretty reliably count on that hyper focus is something they're experiencing. And so I turn
Mm.
that on, what our colleague Jen Steliga refers
Mhm.
to as the engine of their wealth, which is their income and their
Mhm.
spending and the balance between the two. I'm paraphrasing her, so I
It's a,
apologize,
yeah,
Jen.
she says cash flow is the wellspring of a financial plan.
Yes, exactly. Cash flow is the wellspring of a financial plan. Thank you. And so the practice of looking at expenses daily is taking hyper focus and putting it on those expenses every day. The
Mm.
purpose of doing that manually and intentionally every single day is so that that is front and center at least once per day of what that person is paying attention to. And that awareness is invaluable, because otherwise, today that might be something interesting, go through the budget, fill out everything, categorize everything. But tomorrow or next week, now the person is on to the next thing.
Mm.
And whatever habits or disciplines or changes are not sustained. And so by making it a daily practice, at least for some period, and it's not forever, at least for some period, it becomes the target of their hyper focus. The next step is to take that intense attention and turn it into systems. And over time, those systems can change from being something that takes a lot of conscious thought. With practice, it becomes unconscious. And the analogy I like to give for this is cooking from scratch. I know that
Mm.
you and your wife cook almost all of your own meals at home.
Mostly her,
If
yeah.
mostly her. If you had some sort of digestive trouble and going out to restaurants, things just never quite sat well with you. What we're doing by looking at daily expenses is taking ourselves
Mm,
home, cooking from scratch, knowing exactly what ingredients we're putting in every meal,
mm,
and figuring out what works. And then
right.
over time, we build a collection of recipes that we're still cooking at home. Those are the conscious systems that we put in place.
The ones that
So
made
it's
me feel good, I'm gonna keep going in that direction. Yeah.
exactly. And we don't have to come up with each recipe every time because we've written it down and now we can repeat.
Mm,
And over time, you probably don't even need to look at those recipes anymore. And
hmm
if you do go out to restaurants, this is where it becomes an unconscious system. Even if you do go out to restaurants, then you know pretty darn well what's going into that restaurant food and whether you're going to feel good eating it or not because of
hmm
all of the constellation of habits and experiences you've built cooking your
mm.
own food, making your own recipes, and building those systems over time. So we're doing that with transactions by looking at them every day. And then down the road, it gets to where you're like Brad Barrett on Choose FI, where he can't even conceive of needing a budget because he just lives within the budget that is Brad Barrett.
And this really reminds me of the idea of people, you know how a lot of people, especially in the new year, people say, I want to start working out more and they try to get a new workout routine. And something fascinating I heard is a lot of people say that they'll say, "Hey, I want to do weight training 3 times a week."
Mm-hmm.
Guess what's really hard to do? Create a habit that happens 3 times a week. Right. But
Yes,
so
exactly.
I heard this case that, hey, if you want to do say 45 minutes, right, 3 times a week, just do 15 minutes a day every day. And
Right.
then once you've built the daily habit, then you can kind of then you can take a day off in between. But it really like you need to actually start at the daily system. And same thing with Jen. She talks about it as an experiment. She actually puts like a kind
Mm-hmm.
of an exciting twist on it. Again, leveraging
Yeah.
that excitement of saying, "Hey, let's because everybody, if you say, hey, you want to do an experiment, everybody says yes. Like no matter how negative you are in life, everybody's like, oh, I'll try that out." So yeah, she says like, let's try this. Let's break it down into its smallest pieces. Let's try this. And then you build that intentional habit and you again, like you said, you decide like which transactions are helpful, which transactions are hurtful over time.
Mm-hmm.
I actually I leverage therapy and financial planning. I talk about the difference between short-term benefits that have long-term consequences,
Mm-hmm.
right? And short-term consequences with long-term benefits, or
Yeah.
really short-term sacrifices with long-term benefits.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's when you talk about the daily transaction, you can help people realize even for themselves, like, when they buy something, they can say, for example, I spent money on therapy. When they see that transaction, they say, that was a short-term sacrifice financially, but for a long-term benefit because like
Yes.
I'm improving my mental health and mental wellness. Whereas if they went out to eat at that, they went to the bar last night, they can,
Mm-hmm.
day after, hopefully they're feeling all right enough to look at the budget that next day. But they look at their transaction and they say, that was a short-term benefit. I got to spend time with my friends, but it has a long-term consequence. I think a lot of times we think about simplicity is like, something that like, oh, like that's what dumb people need, or that's like, if we're working with smart people, we need complex systems. And when we're working with dumb people, we need simple systems. But I
Mm-hmm.
think what we're revealing here is that even the smartest people you work with, the doctors, the lawyers, like especially people who bring in a lot of wealth in the, financial advisory world, sometimes we make an assumption that since they're a academically smart person, maybe with like you, like, having a master's degree from MIT,
Mm-hmm.
most would make an assumption that you want your system to be complex. Whereas the
Right.
best thing for you might actually be to simplify. You don't try to automate the transactions and the budget from day one. Like, do you allow that
That's
to happen?
correct. Where I start is manual transaction entry, and I have sort of loosened up over time to allow automated importing of the transactions. Like if it shows up in your bank account, then it shows up in a tool. I use YNAB, but I work with clients who use Monarch, Money, and others. It's not particular to anyone. However, I do still insist at the start that folks categorize the
Mm.
transactions manually.
Themselves.
Yes, yes.
Mm.
And the benefit there is awareness. It over and over, it's using the power of your awareness and your focus. One common misconception is that this necessarily has to take a long time. For me, it takes 3 to 5 minutes in the morning, but
Mm.
that's because I'm very practiced at it. At first, it might take 10 or 15 minutes, but for something that can have a powerfully positive
Mm.
effect on a person's life, such as allowing them to change to a job that's better suited with them, or preserving their primary partner relationship, or preventing a divorce, or allowing kids to go to college. Those are pretty important to people.
Mm.
And so, if I can give them the confidence that if they pay attention to this for
Mm.
5 to 10 minutes every morning for a month or 2 months and then put it into a system, that's a pretty easy yes,
Mm.
as long as they're bought in to running that experiment, like you said.
Mm.
Try it on like a sweater. You can take it off, but don't try and decide whether the sweater fits before you try it on. That's
Mm.
that's an expression I like to use.
When clients come to you, that means like there's some willingness to change and you really leverage, like especially in the short term, you leverage that focus. So
Yes.
does that mean that do people typically come with their why, their WHY, or do you have a process in place for helping them establish why it's important to do these things for long-term outcomes?
Typically, people do come with a why. When not all of my clients are ADHD or neurodiverse, and we're focusing on ADHD today very
Hmm.
intentionally because it's a deep topic. But I work with other kinds of neurodiversity, like autism spectrum disorder, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, sensory integration, processing disorder. So not everyone comes to me from those worlds.
Hmm.
I also get what you might call standard financial planning clients, and they
Like the stuff
recognize,
that's in the textbook, right?
yeah, yeah, where they for whatever reason connect with me, and it's
Mhm.
not because of the neurodiversity angle, but it's because of who I am, how I speak, the tools that I use, or maybe they got a recommendation
Mm.
from a friend. But the folks who come from the neurodiverse world, the ADHD world, they tend to come with a pretty big why, that something is painful enough in
Mm.
their life or meaningful enough that they're ready to make a change.
Mm.
And later on, other whys may emerge once we've solved that crisis.
Mhm.
Once the budget is no longer consistently negative, and once the person isn't getting themselves further into debt, then we can
Mhm.
look at things like
Mm.
paying off the house, or saving for kids' college, or building a mother-in-law suite so the parents have a place to come when they don't want to live in their own home
Mm.
later in their life. So those things emerge, but often there is a crisis, and that's why they're calling me.
I would love to hear, like, when you describe those, experiments to working with clients, I'm sure there's multiple experiments. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about not just cash flow, but also like the balance sheet and, how that comes together too. What types of feedback do you get with that system?
It might surprise you, but it's usually positive and willingness to
Hmm.
try. I think it helps that I relate my own story beyond just the individual uh, entering their transactions every day. The next step is that they're creating a plan for the week, and this is about their money, about the change that they're making
Mm.
in their money life. And then each evening, they're creating an action that will move the needle that they're going to accomplish the next day. A plan for the week, which contains daily actions. And what I asked people to do, at first, it was just to share it with me.
Hmm.
I asked them to share, what was your action for today, and did you accomplish it or not? And
Mm.
this is a big step for many people. I make it very clear I want to hear whether you accomplish it or not, and I will not tolerate any guilt or shame
Mm.
or self-blame or I always do this
Mm.
or any of that. I'm
Yeah.
there's no place for that in this conversation. A reflection is okay. You
Hmm.
know, this is what I made more important, or these were the circumstances that resulted in me not accomplishing it. That's okay. You know,
Mm.
we can seek to understand, but I'm not necessarily interested in fixing it right then or jumping to a conclusion about what
Mm.
will fix it, because just building the habit of
Mm.
reporting what you intended to accomplish and whether you accomplished it is a success.
Wow.
And it helps diffuse a pattern of
Mm.
shame and guilt that is very common with people with ADHD about all the things that they should just be able to do. I just need to, or
Mm.
why can't I? It's very common and it's very damaging.
Mm.
And I'm not interested in it because it's not helpful.
Right.
What is helpful is, okay, I've noticed that when I go to this particular grocery store without a list, I don't end up getting the things I need. I'm okay with observations and then
Hmm. Yeah.
making a plan for change next time.
Well.
But that daily practice of reporting is part of what we're training. It builds confidence in the
Mm.
person, in themselves. And I've extended that to small groups where
Oh,
now
wow.
people aren't just reporting to me, they're reporting to peers. They'll connect over different platforms, but the most
Hmm.
common one is Discord. Some people choose to
Hmm.
use Slack or WhatsApp. And so they're reporting this to peers, and it's sort of like group therapy.
Mm.
I'm interested in expanding that because
Yeah.
it's been very helpful and it frees up some of my bandwidth.
Are they going into working with you, kind of understanding that's how it's going to be, or is that something they just learn about you and your process throughout?
I think it's helped the more I've communicated on YouTube and Facebook and other
Hmm.
platforms by video. That's come across. So now people are starting to come to me expecting that.
Cool.
The other avenue where that was happening was if people knew me from another world, like from the ADHD community, which
Hmm.
I'm also a part of, sort of like I'm a part of
Hmm.
Measure Twice Planners. I'm a
Oh,
part
nice.
of ADHD communities where researchers and individuals are helping each other learn strategies, share stories.
Mm.
Uh,
Accountability, right? Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So if they knew me from that world and then they learn I'm
Mhm.
a financial planner, then they come in expecting it.
I think a lot of times people think a niche is like I work with doctors, I work with lawyers, but a niche it
Hmm.
can not only be like the type of person you serve or where they work, but it can also be you can have a niche in your process. I know we could certainly have a whole nother call about this, but could you describe briefly, do you have one service model or do you have multiple options in your firm?
So my firm, I'm advice only,
Mhm.
which means I don't take custody or discretion of anyone's money. I know I'm preaching to the choir. You know everything I'm talking about, but advice only.
Mhm.
I'm fee only, which means I don't sell any products like insurance or mutual funds. The
Mhm.
only compensation I receive is from the client that I'm serving,
Mhm.
and I don't accept affiliate compensation of any kind,
Mhm.
whether hard dollar or soft dollar. So, literally, the only person paying me is the person across from me
Mm.
who I hope benefits from my advice. And then finally, I'm an hourly financial planner. So I have an hourly rate, it's $350 an hour.
Mhm.
And depending on how much work I do for the person, whether it's face to face or me doing work for them behind the scenes that I then bring to them, then that's what they pay. And the typical engagement is I will do an initial financial plan, which ranges from 10 to 40 hours. Some
Mhm.
have been more than 40 hours, some complex international real
Mm.
estate
Wow.
business, multiple divorces. You can get into some, for me, super interesting, but
Right.
takes a while to get your hands around it. But most are in that 10 to 40 hours at the very top end for the initial financial plan. And that takes from start to finish 2 months
Mhm.
typically, which includes gathering all the data. I do some initial modeling where I show clients a model of their financial plan. And the software I use is both Projection Lab and
Mhm.
Income Lab.
Mhm.
Even though they both have the word lab in them, they're totally different tools. Just a coincidence.
It's a labyrinth
Uh,
of financial planning software. Yeah.
yeah. And what's nice about those tools is that the clients have access to almost, if not 100%, all the same switches and levers that
Oh,
I
yeah.
have.
That's great.
And I also get people, because Projection Lab is also a consumer facing software. I get
Mhm.
clients coming to me through that community
And they just
who
connect you
want,
to their account effectively.
yes. And then once we've run through a number of what if scenarios,
Hmm.
then I condense that into what you might call a traditional financial plan, which is a PDF,
Hmm.
and it has a balance sheet and a description of their accounts like pre-tax, Roth, brokerage, a look at insurance, uh, a retirement projection plan, a financial independence plan,
Hmm.
and then that's the product. That's the final product. There may be some actions that stretch out over a couple of weeks or even
Hmm.
months, such as maybe unwinding an overly complex taxable brokerage account that I've inherited from another
Hmm.
advisor.
Hmm.
You don't want to necessarily sell all the capital
Right.
gains all at once, but typically, in a couple of weeks, the actions are taken care of.
Hmm.
After that, it's as needed.
Hmm.
And so I check in with people 2 to 3 times a year. And depending on what they need, it might be an hour, 3 hours, 4 hours. Then on occasion, a big life event will happen, such
Hmm.
as a relocation due to a job, a divorce, a death in the family. And
Hmm.
then that necessitates a bigger replan where it might be something on the order of the initial financial plan,
Hmm.
although it's usually less. Like if the initial plan was 15 hours,
Hmm.
even a pretty major replan would be like 9 or 10. One of the things that I really like, and this was surprising to me in the hourly model, I thought it might be that people wouldn't want to call me after
Hmm.
the initial financial
Hmm.
planning engagement because they say, "Oh, I'm on the clock. I don't want to spend money." But it's actually been the opposite.
Hmm.
It's been, that if they need a 36-minute problem solved, that's all they're going to pay for. I
Hmm.
bill in tenths of an hour, so zero point 0.6 hours, and so the frequency of communication, I've been pleasantly surprised because sometimes just a little bit of guidance or course correction
Hmm.
can have a huge positive effect. So we've talked about the daily practices of
Hmm.
paying attention to transactions for the purpose of building awareness and using hyper focus to
Hmm.
eventually transition into conscious systems and then eventually unconscious systems. We've talked about the daily actions where the person reports to me or to their success team about what they intend to do. whether they did it or not, and any observations.
Hmm.
Beyond that, I ask people to do a monthly net worth update.
Hmm.
This isn't necessarily a specific ADHD thing,
Hmm.
but I find it's just as powerful as
Hmm.
it is for just about everyone, almost surprisingly powerful to see where everything is, what it adds up to, how it's changed.
Hmm.
And then that's monthly. And then on an annual basis, I, with clients at first, and eventually I graduate them to doing it themselves to make a plan for the year. And I call it an annual savings plan.
Hmm.
I guess I'm sort of leading the witness there that it should be a net
Got it.
savings.
Annual
Um,
overspending plan. Yeah. Annual savings
yeah.
plan.
Now, for someone who's post-retirement or
Yeah.
post-FI, it's different. It's a
Hmm.
decumulation plan. In that annual savings plan, what's all the money that's coming in? How much of it do I intend to save?
Hmm.
What savings rate is that likely to
Hmm.
produce? And then on a monthly basis, that net worth update updates that savings rate. So, if I thought I was going to hit a 20% savings rate, oh, look, I'm at a 24% savings
Hmm.
rate. What made that possible?
Oh, cool.
Something like that. And then the final thing, which um, we haven't talked about, is I use calendaring. And what I mean by calendaring is every single recurring expense or financial event in a
Mhm.
person's life, I ask them to put it either on their calendar as a
Hmm.
reminder. If there's a bill that has any chance of being forgotten
Hmm.
because it's not paid automatically, and
Hmm.
this might seem counterintuitive, but at first I ask people not to automate their bill pay for
Hmm.
the same reason as I have people manually
Yep.
enter transactions. We will get there, but I really want the person or the family to be aware of every action they're taking because then they can decide, is this something I want to keep doing?
Hmm.
You know,
They might
do
end up
I?
loving it.
Yeah, they might end up loving it. So all of those go on the calendar as reminders. Some people like to use Apple reminders.
Mhm.
Other people like to use Google Calendar. It's a very frequent thing for folks with ADHD to miss bill payments, and it's referred to as the ADHD tax or misrenewing their driver's license or stuff like that.
Right.
Again, do other folks struggle with that? Absolutely. It's
Mhm.
just almost guaranteed, that
Mhm.
folks with ADHD have some sort of that
Mhm.
experience. Calendaring is also
Yeah.
a part of the system.
I was gonna say you should start a whole tax firm for ADHD for people who, don't get their taxes done or at least don't, file for
I would be
extension.
the first customer.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. I know a lot of people have follow-up questions. You're always on the live calls. I love that you've been, not just with us, but just really a supportive member of Measure Twice Planners over the last year. I just looked, it's almost been a whole, we need to put it on the calendar, right? A full year
Hmm.
anniversary for Aubrey. On your notes, you have a parting message, and maybe rather than paraphrasing, you could just, share it with us before we go today.
You could call this the superpower or super weakness of ADHD, but I had a challenge in preparing for this very interview
Hmm.
because I cared about it so much.
Hmm.
And once I got rolling, however, my heart and soul really opened up because this topic means so much to me and you and Measure Twice planners and the people we can help. So that's where this message came from and
Hmm.
and here's what it says. Your attention and awareness is your most powerful tool. Structure your priorities and your environment to maintain your attention on your intentions every day, and positive progress is inevitable. Be gentle, be patient, Release guilt and shame as much and as often as you can. And when you feel stuck, involve another person, perhaps even help another person. Help is a circle that embraces the giver and the receiver.
It is so hard in financial planning or just any helping profession. I say that, we're typically kind to everybody but ourselves. And I think that that parting message is beautiful and something that, again, I'm gonna clip just this part and maybe like make it very accessible to everybody. Put it at imagine putting that little video clip right at the bottom of your email that you could just, put a little tag to. Like that's so beautiful. And I love that you slowed it down intentionally so that we'd actually listen, not just hear it, but actually listen to the words you're saying. Well, you are a beautiful person, Aubrey. I really appreciate you being here. Even if you weren't a member of Measure Twice Planners, outside of the membership, it's amazing to have your friendship. I can tell you're a friend and not just a colleague, within the profession. And
Absolutely.
I love that we can be transparent. One of the core values, generosity, transparency. It blows me away, like how much more willing we are to be vulnerable and transparent with people who share those core values. And we've put a little bubble around ourselves in this private community. But I'm sure, with the clients you serve and the other planners you come across and LinkedIn and social media, that we're really spreading this out into the open public as well. So I appreciate you so much. And I know you've got to go to your next big thing on your calendar, but I really appreciate you being here. And I'm so excited for our next conversation.
Thank you very much, Cody, for this and for everything you're doing in Measure Twice planners and in the world.
The way you embrace the other person on the other side of the screen, or kind of figuratively on the other side of the table, it
Yeah.
reminds me a lot of kind of a Mr. Rogers character in the best way. um
Well,
Aubrey,
he's one of my heroes. I
yeah,
tear up just thinking about him.
I know. It makes me think if they ever rebooted Mr. Rogers, I'd love for you to be him, and I'll be the piano. I'll be the piano player in the background. How about that?
Deal.
That's awesome. That's
I
awesome.
am in 100%.